So thank you so much for being part of this informative and engaging professional development mastermind event. With our combined resources and expertise, we're building a dynamic resource platform for future generations. So I'm happy to introduce our first SHETalk presenter, Dr. Alexis Crow, lead of geopolitical investing practice at PwC, senior fellow at Columbia Business School, and member of the Global Business and Economics Atlantic Council. At PwC, Dr. Alexis Crow helps corporations and asset managers to capitalize on dislocations in order to profit and expand around the globe. Previously, she was managing director at the New York-based G2 Investment Group, where she was responsible for developing investment strategies for the firm and providing counsel on geopolitical issues across asset classes. Please welcome Dr. Alexis Crow.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I have to thank Desiree for such an amazing opportunity. When a business partner of mine introduced me to her and she told me about this event, I couldn't believe my ears. And so it's really wonderful to be with you all today, and I'm looking forward to our lunchtime mastermind panel as well. I think just in the interest of time, what I will do today is how we are starting right at the morning is just give it a snapshot of the macroeconomic environment in which we're making decisions today. And from that, I kind of wanted to leave you all with a few takeaways that are setting up the scene according to which it is economically significant and statistically clear that adding female executives, whether to a corporate board, to a senior management team, or as a CEO, has the power to unlock financial performance in many different ways across the board. So I've been spending my time with a lot of data from the S&P 1500, from 2 million European companies, as well as Chinese companies, and in a number of different indicators, just this one tiny addition of one female executive can unlock a lot of financial power. So I'll walk us through some of that so you're armed with data when you go back to home base. But just thinking about the economic environment in which we face today, many of you all probably had your eyes on the Fed meeting last Wednesday, of course, when we had a 25 basis point cut to interest rates. And it's been slightly controversial. I'm not going to go into Twitter and the kind of debates that happen on Twitter about monetary policy in the United States. What I will say is that it was slightly controversial because some of the Fed hawks, i.e. those that didn't necessarily want to cut, would have pointed to what looked like stronger economic data. So here we actually have the United States is in its longest growth streak since 1854, so longest running economic expansion in 100 years, 150 years. And then I would say also just looking back to unemployment is another key thing. So unemployment hitting near lows, historic lows, and of course equity markets hitting historic highs. But beneath this data and justifying and warranting somewhat of a cut here in the United States lurks some more underlying vulnerabilities in the system. And one of the ones I spend a lot of my time looking at is wage growth. So we've had a couple of quarters of a modicum uptick in wages, but nothing substantive against the kind of climate in which we're fighting today. So we have this whole focus on unemployment hitting historic lows, but wages are nowhere matching that kind of heat from the economic expansion. And in fact, if you go to Jerome Powell's notes in the Fed meeting, he said, we're not seeing a hot labor market because if you need to see a hot labor market, there needs to be some heat. And we don't see some heat. And I think this is really important today because there's a direct correlation with the geopolitical uncertainty that we're seeing in the trade war, which of course has disrupted stocks over the last few days and indeed over the last year and a half. And this is what I would say is the decline of the purchasing power of the average American household. The same thing is going on in Western Europe as well. So really in advanced economies today, we hear about this hollowing out of the middle class, and of course, one of the contributions to that is the fact that wage growth for the bottom 80th percentile of the income distribution in America has remained virtually flat for 38 years. And that, to me, is how someone like Trump can get into office in one graph. Whatever your politics are, that very clearly explains why people are happy to be able to vote for change. And so what are some of the contributing factors to this? So we have in economics what is called this U-shaped employment curve, according to which most of the jobs have gone to white-collar services at one end of the spectrum. The middle skill, middle wage manufacturing and industrial jobs have been hollowed out in the U shape. And then there's a crowding down into lower skilled services jobs, which are called non-tradable. So a lot of restaurant and hospitality jobs, healthcare and education. The issue is, of course, that for the white collar services jobs, there's a high educational premium put on those jobs. So many people have had to get postgraduate degrees to be there. When someone has been phased out of a middle skill manufacturing and industrial job, they're unlikely to go to that higher end of the spectrum and more likely to go to the non-tradable services end of the spectrum, which is good in a way because it means that those jobs are not vulnerable to a trade war or to trade or to export, but has an issue with wages because if you have more crowding into those jobs, you have a further compression on wages. And so amidst all of this, we also have to look at another contributing factor to the vulnerability in the system today, which is leverage. So how has consumption been expanding in the United States, and how has the average American household gotten by? And a lot of that is debt. It's Groupon, and it's debt, and it's consumer debt. So we hear in the United States today about the auto loan sector, about the student loan sector, but we've recently reached a historic high in $1 trillion in credit card debt. Households are paying anywhere from 15 to 17% interest on those credit cards. And speaking candidly, one of my business partners, one of our top partners in my firm, went to his mother's house and looked at her credit card statements, and she was paying 17% across a number of credit cards, so he had to bail her out. So these are some sort of substantive underlying issues in the system. Also, just speaking on leverage for you in your corporate executive role, here in the United States, we hear about the issue of non-financial corporate debt. The issuance of BBB minus rated bonds, so which is junk bonds essentially, not investment grade material, has increased by 70% in the last 4 years. And I would highlight what I am concerned about is the relationship between passive investing and that corporate debt. So a lot of European funds have come into that corporate debt in 2017. And it puts it prey to a redemption risk. If you had some kind of concern about the deterioration of credit quality, you could see a huge outflow of these funds, which are just open-ended. So these are just things to be able to think about amidst the next crisis. But getting to the bright spots and getting to the she part of the portion of this morning, I would say that as I was digging around into the data, as I mentioned in Europe and the US and China, one thing that's astounding is Europe is the home, I think the spiritual heartland of ESG and impact investing, right? For any of us who have dealt with European investors, it's paramount, primary cause number one. But I thought it was pretty ironic that some of the countries that are most forward-thinking in their green are a little backward in terms of the percentage of senior executives they have as women in their companies. So in Europe today, you have about 60% of the labor force now coming up to be participation from women, but a very slender proportion of executives. So only 19% of corporate board seats in Europe are occupied by women today. And this is in spite of pro-women regulations, some of which we just heard about this organization. Norway passed a law to mandate that 40% of corporate board seats would be occupied by women. 16 other European countries have followed suit. The European Commission has had recommendations for 40% of women-occupied board seats. But today, there's only 19%, and female executives make up only 14% are women today, 5% of CEOs. So this suggests that despite the orange line, which is women in the workforce versus senior executives, there is a glass ceiling in place in Europe. And I think most of that has to do with the kinds of social norms that are very much still in play in various countries. In the United States today, we don't necessarily do much better. In fact, the data looks very similar. So in the S&P 500, only 11.5% of executives today are women, and only 5.1% are CEOs. And so I think it's interesting, there has been a lot of commentary about whether or not the United States is ready for a female president. And one commentator, he's a British columnist, said that the part of the issue with that, he argued, was that when a woman is strong as a president, then she's viewed as being another word for a female dog. But that when she's conciliatory, she's viewed as being weak. And I think the same thing applies to CEOs. So CEOs are probably, that's a very unique skill set. I think that's a very unique vocation. When we think about just the dividend and the multiplier effect of just adding a female senior executive to a team, whatever kind of executive that it is, we're still reaching a significant glass ceiling here in the United States. Interesting, if you break it down by sectors, this is actually the percentage of non-CEO executives, so senior management team that are women. Real estate, we're not doing too well, 8.6%. Telecoms, significantly, only 6%, and IT tech is 9.9%. Why am I highlighting those two sectors particularly? Well, when I was going through the data about the upside and the positive data around economic performance and adding female executives, there's a clear multiplier effect with innovation. So data shows that in studying S&P 1500 firms, if you add one female executive to a management team, you have increased financial performance amounting to $42 million in terms of underlying economic value. And the higher this dividend pays out higher when it's an innovation-focused firm. And so I'm highlighting two of these sectors again, which are most forward, I think, in terms of the new economy and innovation. So why is that? Well, one thing is, if you just look at the senior executive management team, full stop, if you add women to the team, it has been economically shown that you have a more diverse decision-making process. And so you end up with more creative decisions. And interestingly enough, even if a woman holds congruent information to male executives, you still end up with a more diverse and creative decision-making environment. And so the more innovation-focused our firms are today, even whether it's an old-style economy firm, the more it adds to have women on the management team, of course. Another thing is about just going beyond the management team is looking down to the subordinates. And it's clearly demonstrated that a feminine leadership style and having a woman on an executive team can actually increase sales per employee by 14% and increase total factor productivity. Because a woman, it has been shown, is more likely to be able to match skills to tasks at hand. And so part of the reason for that is she's able to come in and actually motivate people in a way that previously sort of controlling words were not necessarily inducive and conducive to personal creativity and motivation. And so another thing I think that's harder to quantify, and it's really important for everyone in this room, is the extent to which women are able to serve as a role model for others. And some of the young people I work with say, when we see a woman in a senior management position, it just shows us that it's possible. And so I think, again, harder as an economist to quantify that, but I think it has a clear multiplier effect. And so I also just wanted to highlight some more solutions. One of them is also in wage growth. So coming back to the original issue that I think we face today in terms of a suppression of wages, it's shown that if you add one female executive to a management team, that she can increase wages for the female median wage and above by 7.8% more than if that person was working for a male CEO. And again, part of that is to do with the signaling that a female executive may be more inclined to be able to judge the productivity level of her own gender. And so when we talk about the gender wage gap, there's a really clear way of solving part of that. And so I also wanted to say that I'm not calling for a coup d'etat For those of you who are familiar with Aristophanes, who was the Greek playwright back in 5th century BC, he wrote 2 plays, one called The Assemblywoman and one called Lysistrata, which were kind of very forward-thinking because they talked about women taking over Athens. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. For the males in this room, I think you'll be very happy to hear that. The data shows that if you add women to a management team, it caps at 60%, meaning if you go above a 60% threshold, the financial performance indicators disappear. So it's not about a coup d'etat or a revolution, it's about complementarity, it's about achieving balance and equilibrium, it's the yin and the yang. And so with that, I will just close by saying that I think that in the debates that we're facing today in the United States and in Europe, and really particularly looking to advanced economies, and also Japan is another one I know that's represented here, I think the solutions are very common sense, and I think they're very pragmatic. And again, I think our society probably tends to overcorrect, and probably, we'll get into a little bit of the Me Too during the session, but I think probably we overcorrected. And thinking about how do we make it palatable and easy and incremental to move forward. And that's where a sea change really comes from. And really empowering males in a certain way to be able to be in support of that. So with that, I will conclude.